Once a key thread in the fabric of any community, newspapers are dying a slow and painful death. Today, in small communities across Canada, things went from bad to worse. Postmedia and Torstar swapped more than 40 local community newspapers and free dailies. In this scheme, though, most will be shut down, like Metro Ottawa, Metro Winnipeg, where Postmedia already has its own free daily newspapers. In total, the closures will result in the loss of approximately 244 jobs. My colleague Susan Prince is here with all the details. Susan, what do we know about this?
Well, in addition to what you've pointed out already, we're looking at, of the 43 papers swapped today, 38 of them are going to be closed down. And we can take a look at a map across. You can see those are the papers. And as we watch this go, you'll see the ones that will be closing down. The jobs that are going to be lost, you talked about the 244 jobs. That's Postmedia's job losses. There will be an additional 46 jobs lost through Torstar. So and the swap is a non-cash agreement. The idea being that these companies were of equal value as they were swapped. Well, clearly they were of equal value if they're all being closed down. And finally, we have Paul Godfrey, the CEO of Postmedia, had his comments today, and here's what he had to say. He said the changes were to focus on the strategic areas and core products that allows us to continue with a suite of community-based products in a deeply disrupted industry. The conversation here has been around the fact that the way that the public gets news information has changed so much that the revenue resources available to small papers is less than it was before, and these businesses cannot be run profitably.
The conversation is certainly one that's been playing out across the country today. What kind of reaction are we seeing to this?
Well, we're getting a reaction across the board. If we start with the Competition Bureau has acknowledged that these two companies have followed protocol and that there was no reason for them. They're not subject to the merger notification provisions of the Competition Act. So in a note earlier today, they said, I can confirm that the Competition Bureau will be undertaking a review of the transaction. Now, understand the companies haven't done anything wrong, but there is a provision to review this kind of transaction regardless. And in another note, we had Howard Law, who's the media director at the Unifor Union, and he pointed out that basically what we're looking at here is a thriving democracy requires a diversity of journalist voices, and today's actions will quiet that diversity. So that's the kind of reaction we are seeing to the news today. Peter?
All right, thanks, Susan. Joining us now for more on this is Bob Cox. He's the publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press, and he's the chair at News Media Canada. It's always good to see you, Bob. Can you put this into context for us? What was this swap really all about?
Well, it was a business decision made by Postmedia and Torstar. From their point of view, from the public's point of view, though, this is probably the worst day in Canadian newspaper history for the closure of newspapers, certainly the single largest number of newspapers closing in one day ever in Canada. So it's a very sad day from that regard.
I mean, this whole notion of a swap, why wouldn't they just shut their own newspapers down rather than, does the swap sort of act as cover for them to be able to do this a little bit easier?
Well, yeah, otherwise they could easily have been accused of colluding. I mean, if they got together in a dark room and traded properties and said, oh, you close Winnipeg and I'll close Vancouver sort of thing, that's generally frowned upon. So in this case, basically, they changed ownership, they exchanged papers, and then they made their own decisions about how to proceed. I might note that they are keeping some of them open, a small number of them open. They're closing down more than 3 dozen, but I believe there's about a half dozen that will remain open. So they did make their own decisions after they traded ownership.
What does this tell us about the underlying health of the Canadian newspaper industry? In a lot of cases, those local newspapers have been doing better than the national chains. What does this swap and all this subsequent closures, what does it tell us?
Well, it tells us that what I've been saying for some time now, and what all of my colleagues have been saying, is that there's a reckoning day coming in which many newspapers will be faced with closure before they get a chance to transition into some new format, to fully transition to digital, for example. And for these newspapers, time really ran out. These are all community newspapers, as you said, in communities mostly in Ontario, but there won't be any future for them. There won't be a digital version tomorrow of any of these newspapers. They're all closed down. The communities they served will have less information information about themselves. And again, it's pulling at one of those strands of democracy, as we say. I mean, these communities will be poorer for the loss of these newspapers, and there aren't immediate replacements. There aren't immediate outlets, news outlets in any format, digital or otherwise, that are going to do what these news outlets have been doing.
Well, that's just it. I mean, you go through Godfrey's statement, the CEO of Postmedia, and he has a line in there about how this will allow us to continue with a suite of community-based products in a deeply disrupted industry. Have we heard anything about what that suite of community-based products even might be?
Well, it's fewer community products is what it is. That's the reality. I mean, there's going to be fewer community newspapers, fewer reporters covering these communities. It's a rationalization. It's really what it is. I mean, I know they have to do it for business reasons, and I certainly respect that. But for the communities involved, it means less coverage, and it's a rationalization of the media that cover all of these communities.
One of the things that you've spoken about on this program before, and you talk about a lot, is the role the federal government can play, just not in terms of a subsidy, but in terms of allocating its advertising dollars to existing newspapers and try to stave off exactly this kind of stuff. Just walk us through what your idea is there. It's basically, I think, that they don't spend their money on Google and Facebook ads and instead spend their money where there are still eyeballs in the remaining community newspapers in Canada. Have I got that right?
Yes, well, I think that one thing to remember is that newspapers in this country still reach a massive audience. Most newspapers' audiences are actually larger than ever because we reach so many people digitally as well as in print. And what we've seen, though, from the federal government and from many governments, actually, not just the federal government, is pulling out of print. So they spend all sorts of money on digital properties, which primarily goes to Google and Facebook, and they don't spend in print. They spend very, very tiny amounts in print, and so they could be helping us out by being a good advertiser and reaching a large public that we continue to reach, but they just don't use us. And we've made this argument many times, and they don't seem very receptive to it. Equally, they're not very receptive to our arguments that we need some financial help to transition and to get from where we are today and to change our business models and to succeed in the future.
And absent any kind of, move like that or money injected from the federal government into this industry somehow, what is the future? Do you expect to see more days like today?
Well, I think we're going to, absolutely, and maybe not as large as today, but so far we've seen trickling. We've seen the melting of a glacier, and like we had an announcement a few weeks ago about the closure of the newspaper, the daily newspaper in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. That's one newspaper. Nobody really notices. Today we had more than 36 newspapers, so today people notice. You're going to see more and more and more of this. We've already seen a lot of it. It's happened, perhaps there should have been more notice paid to it because I made the argument that we don't have a lot of time. We need to act sooner rather than later, and putting off decisions and saying, oh, well, wait to see what happens. Well, what might happen is you end up without a newspaper industry in the country.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Bob, thanks for this.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Bob Cox, publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press and chair at News Media Canada.